There are stories that never make the front page. Not because they lack weight. Not because they are too small or too quiet or too ordinary for the world's attention. But because the person at the center of them spent a lifetime making sure the world only ever saw what they chose to show. And when the end finally came, they made sure of that one last time. Most people heard the news the way you hear about the death of someone who felt like family. Suddenly. Without preparation. A notification on a phone, a bulletin interrupting regular programming, a neighbor mentioning it over a fence with a look that said they weren't quite sure how to hold it either. Andy Griffith was gone. But something else came with that news. Something that didn't fit the grief cleanly. Something that made people stop and read the sentence twice and then read it again. He had already been buried. Not in a few days. Not after a public memorial. Not after the networks had assembled their tributes and the fans had gathered at whatever site the family designated for collective mourning. Already. Hours ago. Before most of America had even finished absorbing the fact of his death, the ground had closed over him, and the man who had lived inside their television sets for 50 years was simply gone. 4 hours and 53 minutes from his last breath to the earth above him. People didn't know what to do with that number. Some reached for outrage. Some reached for confusion. A few reached, quietly and privately, for something that felt uncomfortably close to recognition. As if some part of them had always understood that the man behind Mayberry had been holding something back. Had been protecting something. Had been waiting, with enormous patience, for the moment when he could finally stop performing entirely. That moment arrived on July 3, 2012. And understanding it requires going back much further than most people expect. Not to the television show. Not to Broadway. Not even to the recording that made him famous before most Americans knew his name. Back to a house with no running water in a town at the edge of the Blue Ridge Mountains, where a boy grew up with almost nothing and discovered, in the most unlikely of places, that he had something the world would eventually want very badly. Mount Airy, North Carolina, in the late 1920s, was not a place that promised much to the children born inside it. Particularly not to the children of working men who moved between jobs the way the Depression-era South demanded, without the luxury of preference or the comfort of stability. Carl Griffith worked with his hands. Geneva Griffith held the family together with faith and determination. Between them, they gave their son something that couldn't be purchased with the money they didn't have. They gave him the church. Every Sunday. Every choir rehearsal. Every service where voices rose together inside plain wooden walls, and something happened that the week's hardships couldn't entirely explain away. Young Andy sat inside that sound and felt something shift inside him. Not just the music. Not just the ritual. The specific and irreplaceable sensation of a voice filling a room and changing it. Of sound becoming something people leaned toward rather than away from. He began singing before he could fully understand what singing was for. And those who heard him paused in a way that had nothing to do with politeness. There was a quality in it. Rooted. Patient. Something that sounded less like a child discovering his voice, and more like a man who had already made peace with something most people spend their entire lives running from. A drama teacher named Ed Mickey caught it early. Steered him toward every stage the school had to offer. Andy would speak about Mickey years later with a particular reverence reserved for people who arrive at the right moment and say the right thing. The teacher who looked at a carpenter's son with worn shoes and saw something worth cultivating. That something carried him to Chapel Hill. To a university that felt, to a boy from his background, like an act of almost reckless ambition. He studied music. He studied voice. He stood alongside young men and women from worlds of comfort and connection and understood something that never left him. What a room gives its attention to has nothing to do with where you came from. The early career that followed looked from the outside like a clean, ascending line. A comic monologue about a country preacher encountering a football game for the first time sold hundreds of thousands of copies and made him a name before he had a face most people could place. Broadway followed. A film directed by one of the most respected names in American cinema followed that. And in that film, in A Face in the Crowd, something happened that the industry would spend the next several decades pretending hadn't. He was terrifying. The character he played was a man who used warmth as a weapon, who smiled at the people who loved him and held them in private contempt, who understood instinctively that charm, deployed with precision, could make people believe almost anything. It was a portrait of manipulation drawn from the inside, and Andy Griffith drew it with a conviction that made critics reach for words they didn't usually apply to debut performances.
It was the kind of performance that should have opened every door Hollywood had. Instead, it closed the one door the industry had already decided was his. They didn't want that version. They wanted the warmth without the danger underneath it. They wanted the smile without the knowledge that it could be a strategy. They wanted, in short, someone who could make America feel safe. And so when the offer came, in 1960, to play a small-town sheriff in a fictional version of the Carolina world he'd grown up in, the industry leaned forward with a kind of collective relief. This is what he should be doing. Andy said yes. And the trade he made in that moment would take him decades to fully understand. The Andy Griffith Show arrived at a particular moment in American history. The country was moving fast and not entirely sure it liked where it was going. Anxieties were multiplying. Certainties were dissolving. The comfortable arrangements of post-war life were being challenged from every direction. And into that noise walked Sheriff Andy Taylor. No gun. No aggression. No dominance performed through force. He solved problems by listening. He raised his son by being present in a way that television fathers rarely managed. He moved through Mayberry at a pace that felt like permission to slow down, to believe that decency still worked, that wisdom could be quiet, that a community held together by mutual care was not an impossible fantasy but an actual place you could return to every week. America held on to that permission with both hands. 8 seasons. Number 1 in the ratings at the end of its run, which almost never happens. A cultural imprint so deep that decades later the theme song alone could produce something in people that they couldn't quite name but immediately recognized. But the man inside the sheriff's uniform was navigating something the audience never saw. The gap between who he was required to be and who he actually was had been growing since the first season. Every fan who called him sheriff with reverence that belonged to a real person. Every stranger who expected the patience and gentleness of a fictional character from the complicated human being who had created him. Every year in which the warmth of Mayberry was precisely what the public wanted and precisely what made it harder for him to remember where the character ended. Those who were close to him during those years speak of contradictions. Of a man who could be extraordinarily generous and quietly withholding in the same afternoon. Of a performer who was brilliant at making people feel seen and a private person who kept himself carefully out of reach. Of someone carrying something beneath the surface of all that warmth that never quite found its outlet. The first marriage ended in 1972. 20 years, and then silence. The second marriage followed and dissolved within 6 years. 2 attempts at the private life he was simultaneously too famous and too restless to maintain. He left the show at its peak, which shocked the industry in the specific way that voluntary retreats from success always shock industries built on the assumption that everyone wants more of what is working. He cited exhaustion. Creative restlessness. The need to prove that he was more than one character in one fictional town. What he didn't say publicly, because he rarely said the difficult things publicly, was that he could feel himself disappearing. The decade that followed was professionally brutal in the quiet way that matters more than the loud kind. Not scandal. Not collapse. Simply irrelevance. Projects that found no audience. A public that had decided, with the gentle tyranny of affection, that there was only one thing it wanted from him. He held out. And the holding out cost him years. Matlock gave him a second beginning in 1986. A defense attorney with a sharp mind beneath the folksy surface, a character who was allowed to be strategic in ways Sheriff Taylor never was. It ran for 9 seasons and restored what the wilderness years had eroded. His standing. His relevance. And something more personal than either. A sense that he could exist on television as something more layered than what Mayberry had permitted. But 1983 had already changed him in ways that had nothing to do with ratings. Guillain-Barré syndrome. A neurological disorder in which the body's own immune system attacks the nerves that carry its signals. The paralysis it caused was total at its worst. For a man whose life had been built on presence, on the specific power of being physically in a room and commanding it, the experience of being unable to move, of being uncertain whether movement would ever fully return, was a reckoning of a kind that no professional setback could replicate. He recovered. Not completely. Not without leaving traces. And those who observed him in the years that followed noticed a man who had developed a new and unignorable awareness of what the body could take from you without warning. Of what mortality actually meant when it stopped being abstract. He began, in those years, to think very specifically about the end. Not morbidly. Not with fear, or at least not only with fear. But with the methodical clarity of a man who had watched the entertainment industry treat the deaths of its most beloved figures as programming events. Who had seen grief packaged for consumption. Who had observed, with growing revulsion, the way the machinery of fame turned a person's final hours into content and their burial into a broadcast. He spoke about it with Cindy Knight, his wife since 1983, the woman who had provided what the earlier marriages hadn't. Stability. Privacy. A life that existed outside the performance of itself. He made his wishes known not as vague preferences but as specific instructions. The clarity of someone who had earned the right to decide exactly how this would go. When the time came, it would be on Roanoke Island. It would be private. It would be fast. And it would be finished before the world outside had time to assemble its apparatus. North Carolina law at the time permitted burial on private property under specific conditions. The Griffith family understood those conditions. They had prepared for them. When Andy died on the morning of July 3, 2012, the process that had been planned moved with a precision that left no gap for intervention. 4 hours and 53 minutes. No cameras arrived in time. No journalists positioned themselves outside a hospital because there was no hospital to position themselves outside of. No network assembled its tribute package before the burial was complete. By the time the news reached the people who would have wanted to turn it into something, there was nothing left to turn. The grave is on private land. There is no public marker. No coordinates shared on official platforms. No designated site for the pilgrimage that fans, given the opportunity, would certainly have made. The island does not advertise itself as the final resting place of a television legend because Andy Griffith did not want it to. And because the people who loved him respected that want more than they wanted the comfort of a public moment. Ron Howard, who had known him since childhood, who had grown up under his mentorship on that Mayberry set, did not criticize it. He understood it. That was Andy, he said. That was entirely and completely Andy. Mount Airy still carries him differently. The streets where he learned what a voice could do. The community that produced him and never entirely let him go. The quiet pride of a small town that gave the world something it needed without fully understanding at the time how much the world would need it. He is there in the way places hold people. Not in monuments, though those exist. In something older and less explicable. In the particular feeling of walking streets that shaped someone remarkable and knowing it. The paradox that defines his story is this. He fought for invisibility his entire adult life. He built the architecture of his final years around the certainty that death would not become a spectacle. He succeeded, completely and deliberately, in making sure the world's cameras arrived too late. And yet he is everywhere. In every afternoon rerun. In every person who hums that theme song without being able to say when they first learned it. In every child given a name that came from Mayberry because their parents wanted them to carry something gentle into the world. In every moment when the noise of contemporary life becomes briefly too much and someone, somewhere, finds themselves reaching for the stillness that a fictional sheriff in a fictional town somehow made feel real. That is what he left behind. Not a gravesite. Not a memorial. Not the kind of legacy that requires a plaque or a ceremony or a network special to sustain itself. Something quieter and more durable than any of those things. The understanding that warmth is not the same as openness. That giving people what they need from you is not the same as giving them everything. That a life performed brilliantly for 50 years still belongs, in its most essential parts, to the person living it. Andy Griffith knew the difference between those things from the beginning. From the church choir in Mount Airy, where a boy with nothing discovered that a voice could move people, all the way to a shoreline in North Carolina where a man who had moved more people than he could count finally chose stillness. 4 hours and 53 minutes. The cameras never came. The spectacle never arrived. The finale the industry would have staged never happened. Just the island. Just the people he had chosen. Just the earth receiving him the way it receives everyone, without ceremony, without commentary, without any interest at all in what the ratings had been. He got exactly what he wanted. And somehow, impossibly, he still gave us everything we needed.